Here we are, February 2026, and Democrats will never admit this on camera, but behind closed doors, they're asking the same nervous question. Did we just hand the Republicans a gift by backing Zohran Mamdani? They won't use the word panic in public. They'll talk about unity, energy, excitement, but read between the lines of what they say, and more importantly, what they refuse to say, and the story is obvious. The party embraced a rising star who calls himself a democratic socialist. They watched him topple a scandal-scarred former governor in the New York City mayoral primary, and they told themselves this was the future. Now they're watching the backlash, the attack ads, the internal fractures, and realizing that backing Mamdani might go down as one of the most expensive political miscalculations of this decade. To understand why the panic is real, you have to start with how fast this all happened. A few years ago, Zohran Mamdani was a left-wing assembly member from Queens, known in activist circles but barely a blip on the national radar. Then came 2025. New York City was drowning in anger over rent, transit costs, childcare, and the feeling that the world capital had become unlivable for anyone who wasn't already rich. Into that anger walked Mamdani, young, articulate, and absolutely unapologetic about calling himself a socialist. He ran on a simple, emotionally loaded pitch. The system is rigged, landlords and billionaires are bleeding you dry, and the only answer is a mayor who will take their power away. He promised rent freezes, expanded public housing, big new spending on social services, and he told voters it could all be paid for with higher taxes on the wealthy and corporations. Against that, Democrats put up Andrew Cuomo, the very picture of old guard, scandal-stained establishment politics. In hindsight, it's not surprising what happened. Mamdani's rallies were bigger. His small-dollar donations poured in. His message matched the mood. On primary night, he didn't just squeak by, he crushed Cuomo and stunned the very party insiders who had spent years insisting a candidate like this could never win citywide. The national left celebrated. Articles gushed about his meteoric rise and framed him as the vanguard of a new generation of Democratic leadership. Commentators talked about a Mamdani effect, proof that if you talk relentlessly about affordability and refuse to water down your ideology, you can build a movement powerful enough to beat the machine. Progressives pointed to that win and said, see, we don't need to run as diet Republicans. We can run as who we really are. In those first weeks after the primary, it felt to many like the party had just found its newest star. But if you looked beyond the celebration, you started to see something else. A lot of very nervous, very quiet Democrats in Washington and Albany. Look at how the party's most powerful figures reacted. In a normal world, when your nominee takes over the ticket in the biggest city in the country, the top Democrats rush to a microphone. They brag, they hug, they claim credit. That did not happen here. Governor Kathy Hochul, the state's top Democrat, hesitated, held private meetings with Mamdani, and only endorsed after emphasizing they had differences on policing, taxes, and Israel. That is the political equivalent of endorsing someone with your arms folded. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, both from New York, moved even slower. Their language was cautious. They praised his energy and focus on working families, but were conspicuously vague about his ideology and his most controversial positions. They dragged their feet so long that journalists openly asked why the party's giants were still on the fence about the man who might soon run their home city. That's not what excitement looks like. That's what fear looks like. And then there were the Democrats who didn't bother to hide their discomfort. Tom Suozzi, a Democrat from Long Island who has to face moderate and independent voters every 2 years, wrote that while Mamdani is charismatic and smart, Democrats would be making a grave mistake if they drew the lesson that socialism is what voters want. He warned that most Americans are desperate for stability and competent management, not ideological experiments. Laura Gillen, another suburban Democrat, was even harsher, calling Mamdani too extreme to lead New York City and insisting his agenda was exactly the kind of thing that would push her constituents toward the GOP. These are not Fox News pundits. These are elected Democrats reading the polls in their own districts and sounding a five-alarm fire about what backing Mamdani could mean for them. Republicans, of course, saw that fear and smelled blood in the water. They didn't have to invent a villain. The Democrats had just handed them one. GOP strategists immediately began framing Mamdani as the living embodiment of every stereotype they push about the modern Democratic Party: hostile to police, extreme on Israel, reflexively anti-business, and thrilled to slap the socialist label on his own campaign. In internal memos and on background comments, Republican operatives practically bragged about how giddy they were to have this guy as the face of New York Democrats. They started testing messages that didn't just attack Mamdani in New York City. They tied him to congressional Democrats in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona, and the outer suburbs of New York itself. If you're a moderate Democrat in a swing district, imagine waking up to an ad that splashes Mamdani's photo across the screen and says, "This is what their party really stands for." That's exactly the scenario that has so many of them quietly furious that the party ever let this happen. Why is he so weaponizable? Because his record and rhetoric are tailor-made for contrast ads. On policing, he aligned himself with the defund wing at the height of the movement, accusing the NYPD of being systemically racist and corrupt, and cheering on language that painted officers as an inherent threat to communities of color. In a city where many working-class voters, including Black and Latino residents, want both justice and safety, that's a dangerous place to be. On Israel and foreign policy, his stance during the Gaza war era and his alignment with some of the harshest critics of Israel made him a lightning rod, especially among Jewish New Yorkers and older Democrats who still see Israel as a crucial ally. When a sitting U.S. senator from his own state, Kirsten Gillibrand, publicly criticized his rhetoric and then had to issue a semi-apology for mischaracterizing it, it did not calm the waters. It just underlined how fraught the issue had become inside the party. On economics, his platform of rent freezes, expanded public services, and new taxes on the rich thrills activists who are desperate to reverse decades of inequality. But to older moderates, donors, and small business owners, it looks like a blueprint for driving out investment and accelerating the flight of families and companies to lower tax states. Now, if this story ended with progressive candidate has bold ideas, moderates grumble, party unites anyway, that would be standard Democratic politics. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is that mainstream outlets are openly asking if Democrats have a Mamdani problem. Reporters are quoting strategists who worry that he could become the face of the party's leftward lurch in every swing race. Articles describe Republicans as cheering his impact precisely because they believe it will help them retake the House. When your opponents are this excited about your star, that's not a sign of strength. That's your warning label. And here's where the secretly panicking part really shows. Publicly, Democratic leaders go through the motions. They appear at events. They issue endorsements that sound like they were proofread by a lawyer. They praise his focus on affordability and say they'll work with him if he wins. But privately, when they talk to journalists off the record, they admit the obvious. They're tired of having to answer questions about him in districts where most voters have never heard his name and don't like what they hear when they do. They complain that every story about his campaign drags the entire party into another internal fight about Israel, about policing, about whether socialism is compatible with winning in the Midwest. One senior aide described the constant focus on his candidacy as a distraction for the whole party from coast to coast, and said it makes Democrats look like they revolve around the internal drama of New York progressives instead of the everyday concerns of swing state families. That's not exactly a rave review. The deeper problem for Democrats is that the Mamdani saga exposes a contradiction they've been trying to paper over for years. On one side, they want to be the party of energy, activism, and big ideas, the party that excites young voters, embraces climate action, police reform, and a more critical stance on American foreign policy. On that front, Mamdani looks like a model. He mobilizes volunteers, raises small-dollar donations online, dominates the social media conversation, and represents a diverse, younger generation of leadership. On the other side, Democrats also want to be the party that reassures swing voters they're not extreme, the party of competence, stability, and incremental progress, the party that doesn't scare suburban parents or retired cops. Those voters are tired of chaos. They want normalcy. And to them, A mayoral nominee who proudly calls himself a socialist, has a history of harsh rhetoric on police in Israel, and talks more about redistribution than growth does not scream normal. The party thought it could split the difference. It thought it could let Mamdani win, praise his energy, harvest his turnout, and still keep him at arm's length when talking to moderates. But that's not how politics works in the age of nationalized media and online outrage. You cannot confine a figure like this to one city. When Republicans in other states start tying your Congress members to the Mamdani agenda, it forces every Democrat to answer a question they hate. Do you stand with him? Yes or no? Answer yes, and you risk alienating moderates. Answer no, and you inflame the progressive base that worked tirelessly to get him there in the first place. The party's attempt to have it both ways is exactly what makes this feel like a massive mistake. To be clear, this isn't about whether some of Mamdani's concerns are legitimate. Of course, housing costs are out of control. Of course, working families are being squeezed. Of course, there's a hunger for bolder solutions. Even his critics admit that his relentless focus on affordability hits a nerve, and that's why he caught fire so quickly. The question isn't whether the problems he describes are real. The question is whether the way he wants to solve them is politically survivable for a national party that has to win in purple districts, not just deep blue primaries. When you tie the Democratic brand to the word socialist, to maximalist rhetoric on foreign policy, and to policies that scare off small business owners and police unions, you are not just making a local bet. You are reshaping how tens of millions of voters see the party. That's the trap Democrats walked into when they backed Zohran Mamdani, or at least when they failed to stop his rise. They told themselves they could ride the wave of enthusiasm, that his win in New York would prove the party is listening to young people and renters. They tried to convince themselves that voters who went for Trump in 2024 would somehow be attracted to a party that looks more like European social democracy in America's biggest city. But every piece of real-world evidence since his primary win points in the opposite direction. Republicans are thrilled, swing district Democrats are anxious, donors are nervous, party leaders are hedging, and the guy at the center of it all is not moderating his core identity. He's leaning into it because that's who he is. That combination, a candidate who won't back off his label, a base that loves him for it, and a broader electorate that's deeply skeptical, is exactly why Democrats are quietly starting to panic about what they've done. The truth is, Zohran Mamdani didn't create the Democratic Party's identity crisis. He exposed it. For years, party elites tried to square the circle, be the party of Bernie and AOC in primaries, then talk like Bill Clinton in general elections. They tried to reassure Wall Street and suburban moderates that everything was under control, even as they embraced activists who talked about dismantling capitalism and policing from the inside. That contradiction was always going to break somewhere. It just happened to break in New York City, in the form of a young socialist who beat the machine and refused to apologize for what he believes. Now the party has to decide whether backing him was an experiment they can learn from, or a massive mistake that they'll spend years trying to explain away. And that's why, if you strip away the talking points and look at the behavior, you see exactly what this title says. Democrats are secretly panicking that backing Zohran Mamdani was a massive mistake. They're not panicking because he's a bad speaker. They're not panicking because he can't win a primary. They're panicking because he can win, and because every day his name is in the headlines, it forces them to confront a question they've been dodging for a decade. Are they a party of pragmatic center-left governance, or a party of democratic socialism dressed up for national television? As long as they refuse to answer that, as long as they keep trying to have it both ways, the Mamdani mistake will hang over them in their strategy memos, in their donor calls, and most of all, in the minds of the swing voters they cannot afford to lose again.